Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's TDC Virtual Salon. For our event this afternoon, we have Kelly Walters, Ain't That a Shame? Kelly Walters runs an independent design studio, Bright Polka Dot, where she produces print and digital ephemera for publications, exhibitions, and social campaigns. Kelly is a designer and educator whose work investigates the intersection of Black cultural vernacular in mainstream media. Her research practice is deeply intertwined with the molding and shaping of cultural identity and an investment in making visible historical visual expressions that reclaim a Black voice within the field of graphic design. She's also an assistant professor and associate director of the BFA Communication Design program at Parsons, where I met her. And we originally had this talk scheduled in March in our space before our lockdown. And now I want to welcome Kelly finally to the TDC.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here. I definitely was scheduled back in March, and in some ways it's actually great that I'm here now. There's so much that's happened in the summer that's informed just me really thinking holistically about what I've been researching and how I've been making. So I'm actually in a way thankful that it's happening now, because it's allowed for a deepening and development of some of the ideas that I've been looking at. So I named this presentation Ain't That a Shame, partially because of kind of where we are right now. I have been really reflective of the pandemic, the political, social unrest, just the election that's looming in just a few weeks. I think I've been really sort of trying to process through a lot of the research and work that I do around what is actually happening right now. And to begin my presentation, I wanted to stem from the US presidential debate that happened a couple weeks ago. And it's so close yet so far in so many ways. Of many things happened in that debate that were really poignant. And for me, I think one of the things that I took away with in terms of the exchange between Chris Wallace and Donald Trump was the question that Chris Wallace posed around ending racial sensitivity training. And I just want to go through the exchange around two questions that Chris Wallace posed. One, it started with, why did you decide to do that, to end racial sensitivity training? And do you believe that there is systemic racism in this country? And Donald Trump responded with, I ended it because it's racist. I ended it because a lot of people were complaining that they were asked to do things that were absolutely insane. That is a radical revolution that was taking place in our military, in our schools, and all over the place. And you know it, and so does everybody else. So for me, what stuck out in this part of the exchange was the idea that looking at and investigating racial sensitivity could be considered an absolutely insane notion. So that stuck with me first. The second follow-up question that Chris Wallace posed, just to kind of dig deeper, was, why are you seeing this, or what is radical about racial sensitivity training? And the next passage was even more bizarre for me, right? Where it said, if you were a certain person, you had no status in life. It was a sort of reversal. And if you look at the people, we were paying people hundreds of thousands of dollars to teach very bad ideas, and frankly, very sick ideas. And really, they were teaching people to hate our country. And I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to allow that to happen. We have to go back to the core values of this country. They were teaching people that our country is a horrible place, it's a racist place, and they were teaching people to hate our country. So again, what I took away from this as an educator, as someone who looks at race and is someone who is really invested in looking at how design contributes to our understanding of racial discrimination, I found this to be striking. And also the idea that research around this space, or teaching folks about the fact that there could be racial discrimination, could be seen as a problem for some people. And so I dove even further onto the White House government website, which again has all kinds of things that have been modified since Trump's election. I just was really intrigued by this new executive order on combating race and sex stereotyping. And I'm not going to be able to kind of get through all of it here, but these are some of the snippets of the language that's used on this site around that, you know, the idea that saying colorblindness and meritocracy, or thinking about the fact that there could be bias, that there's rhetoric on this site that's really pushing against any kind of seeing that there might be discrimination, white privilege, white supremacy that's at play and still needs to be combated. So I was, again, like I said, as someone who's digging deep into images of Blackness, trying to understand what race looks like, to see the president sort of co-opt the site to kind of modify it with this other warped thinking was disturbing. And I counterpoint that with a passage that came from Christopher Wray, who's the FBI director for the United States. And last year, he mentioned the danger, I think, of white supremacy, violent extremism, or another kind of extremism is of course significant. We assess that it is a persistent, pervasive threat. We tackle it both through our Joint Terrorism Task Force on the domestic terrorism side, as well as through our civil rights program on the civil side, through hate crime enforcement. So as I'm hearing, you know, again, the president sort of counter with this alternative view, and then you see that very clearly white supremacy and violent extremism is still persistent and pervasive, right? That has never gone away, but it creates an understanding of the tug of war that has continued to exist in the United States. And so in 2020, in this moment, and being reflective of these most recent sort of debates, but also thinking about what is considered domestic terrorism, what is considered a threat to the livelihood of a lot of people of color, a lot of Black folk, I wanted to go back to understand even more of the context behind sort of the founding of the country, but also the moments at which it started to sort of rupture, right? And so I start back in 1860, around the time when it was the election of Abraham Lincoln, right? And what was significant in this moment is that white supremacy and the institution of slavery were threatened by the election of Abraham Lincoln. He opposed the act of slavery moving into the Western territories. And in addition to that, we had several Southern states, some of which were South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, for instance. They came together to cede from the Union, right? So at one point, we were all one big happy family. And then at another point, in this point of time, there was clearly a rupture based around the ideas around white supremacy and slavery. And I want to just highlight this because the Confederacy was in existence from around 1861 to 1865. But what we see today through the Confederate flags, through the rhetoric that's very tied to the Confederacy, is that its residual still exists. And for me, it's the residual that shows up in design. So I'm constantly looking for the residual, if you will. And I'll refer to that like in multiple points kind of as we keep going. But if we look at this image, right, of National Geographic, this is from National Geographic, this is an example of the boundary between the Union and the Confederacy, right? So we see this division between the northern and the southern states. We see and understand messages that will exist even now in terms of just lots of holdover of the ideologies that were present during this era. And in 1861, between 1861 and 1865, this is when we had the American Civil War. So this was significant because it fell in the middle of Abraham Lincoln's tenure as president. And he's significant because, right, in 1863, just a few short years after he was elected, he established the Emancipation Proclamation, which outlawed slavery. So this was a critical moment, right, where there was clearly, political push to move away from that construct. But if we look further in time, right, and we go a few years after that, clearly throughout the Civil War, there was a back and forth, like I said before, of this tug of war. On April 9th in 1865, General Robert E. Lee of the Confederate Army surrendered to the Union, right? So this is a moment at which he is surrendering the Confederacy, and then like a couple days later, Abraham Lincoln is shot, right, and is assassinated. And so I find this to be this, like I said, the tension space that continues to show up. It continues to get exacerbated as we see right now. But clearly there was resistance to the idea of, everything that was kind of coming out of Abraham Lincoln's sort of push towards emancipating African Americans and former slaves. And so after we lose Abraham Lincoln, what happens in the interim in 1865 and 1866 is that Southern states are starting to pass the Black codes, right? And these codes are extremely significant because what happens now is that there's restriction placed on voting, the right to bear arms, congregating in groups, learning to read and write, and exerting free speech. And what's crazy is like the collapse of time that seems to be, I feel like we could be in some ways in 1865, because all of these points right here are happening as we speak right now, leading up to this election, right? That people are being disenfranchised. The idea of congregating in groups has always been an issue for Black folks who are in space and are considered a threat, perhaps, to some white individuals that are near them. There's always suspicion, there's always fear. And there's also the threat around advancing oneself. The idea that a Black person could read and write, to be able to sort of have more of an understanding of what's happening around them. Like all of this suppression still exists in many ways today. And if we think about that fact, right, we think about the fact that after the Civil War, there was the emergence of these three major ideologies in terms of emancipation, in terms of Reconstruction, in terms of white supremacy, right? We see these threads still, and they come up and they come down. We see examples of wanting to have freedom, but we see examples of how white supremacy takes form and continues to sort of pervade in various aspects of culture. And I also want to flag, again, just bear with me a few of these kind of like historical points, is that the Reconstruction Act of 1867 required that all states uphold equal protection under the 14th Amendment. So again, this is another critical juncture where the government is wanting to make sure and ensure that there is, the Southern states are actually following through on the requirements to ensure that Black men at this point are given protection under this moment in the rebuild, if you will, of the country. And the other thing that I also want to flag is that white women were not able to vote in federal elections until 1920. And then women of color were not even given the right to vote until 1965. And so again, if we keep these kind of elements at play, that if we talk about a Black woman, there's no political control, there's not really even the ability to understand how one could sort of move forward in life. There's all these different restrictions that are happening. And I say this at the same time as there's like the emergence of so many Black colleges and academics and scholars. And so like there's this kind of duality that happens that we see even despite all of the sort of oppression. And in 1877, the United States government created the Compromise of 1877. And this repealed any kind of progress, right? So it's like saying, okay, government, we are allowing for, all Black people, or in this case, Black men, to have political power, political control, But actually 10 years later, the government was like, you know what, we're not really down for this anymore, right? And so Southern states essentially created legislature that disenfranchised Black men and their ability to acquire and maintain political power. And this is right by, I would say, around 1901. Everyone who had acquired power in the interim of the Reconstruction era was essentially removed from that power. So if we're basically saying that we're not in control, we're not able to vote, you're really sort of eliminating the ability for a whole population of people to contribute to ways to kind of adjust their livelihood as they exist as former slaves, right? And the last two sort of really tragic points that I'm mindful of, I think, in my research around this era, and this comes from the NAACP, they noted that in 1882 to 1968, over 4,000, almost 4,700 lynchings occurred in the United States. And this amounts to about 72% of people who were lynched, right? That if we look at the numbers between Black and white and any kind of lynching that was happening between white folks that were helping Black people, that the overwhelming number demonstrated that Blacks would be retaliated against. And the racial terrorism, the lynchings, the riots, the segregation, all of this was persistent and pervasive, and it upheld white supremacy. So for us to look at design through this lens is really critical, because what we're seeing is a level of oppression where retaliation could happen, where clearly the resistance that white supremacists were sort of putting forth were threatened and fearful of any kind of advancement by Black people. And the last piece that I'll include too in terms of this historical context is that the Jim Crow laws that were created by white Southerners to enforce racial segregation, they were in existence from 1870s through the 1960s. So this is like all the way from 1870s to, if we're saying 1960s, my mom was just born just ahead of the 1960. And so I think about how close we are to that moment, or how close I am in terms of my family to kind of the vestige of the ways that Black people have been impacted culturally. So to kind of pivot us now, right, and thinking about the term Jim Crow, Jim Crow comes from the sort of performance that Thomas Dartmouth Wright, or T.D. Wright, was known to play in blackface. And so he's a performer. And I just wanted to quote a passage that came from University of South Florida's library wrote this sort of description around an exhibition they put together that looked specifically at blackface minstrelsy. And it stated, the persistence of minstrelsy and its widespread influence on all aspects of American culture is well documented by scholars. Although its origins are not, no one can be sure when the first white man blackened up to play an African American on stage. However, T.D. Rice developed the first popular known blackface minstrel character called Jim Crow in 1830 and became the father of minstrelsy. And so I highlight the term Jim Crow or Jim Crow laws as it relates to entertainment and as it relates to the concept around white performers acting as though they are Black or have, demonstrating Black, what is thought to be Black characteristics. And so in another example of a illustration, I wanted to pair up, another reference that I've looked at that is from Childish Gambino's This Is America. And so throughout the next couple of slides, a lot of the examples that I want to sort of touch on are from the past, but then I'll show kind of what they remind me of, or what, in this case, this music video and the choreography in this one segment was related to, right? That there's so much of this back and forth of the tug of war, but also of the reference of the past that's really informing a lot of the visual design of the present. And in terms of like moving into this sort of more contemporary space, and again, walking backwards, is that our visual experience of the album cover or music and its like primary sort of visual that's on the outside that represents like a musician or an artist or a band. We, at this point in 2020, this is again a screenshot of my Spotify, we see this in like a small square, right? That represents a particular individual or ensemble. And going backwards in time for me, I remember I used to have CDs. These were my first sort of access to music when I was coming of age. But those CD covers are also connected to that small square in terms of what we see it as today. And then if we step back even further, I also was of the era that had a little bit of, you know, the cassette tapes. We're right on the cusp between cassette tapes to basically CDs. But I do recall my parents having a large selection of these as well. And again, I'm bringing these to light because like the transition between, you know, the small square that we see on Spotify to the CD, to the cassette tape, to the record album, right, has a direct lineage to what I'll show next are music sheet covers. And these were the pop culture of that time. And so my understanding of pop culture and music and the visual design that's connected to that in my present context is really connected to understanding the design of albums and CDs and cassettes, as I mentioned. But in doing further research and looking further back, I came across this other form of print media that was called, sheet music, but more specifically, I was drawn to the covers of this sheet music. And so I will flag that some of the images that I'll show in the next subsequent slides, some of them are jarring in many respects. So I do just highlight that in terms of just looking at the images and trying to understand what we're seeing. But this first one that I'm showing you is called All I Want Is My Chickens. And in terms of the structure of many of the sheet covers that I've looked at, they're kind of deconstructed into a couple of different pieces, right? That you generally see a large headline or the name of the song, and it takes up a huge section of the top area of the cover itself. You might also see a photograph as photography became more dominant. As it moved from illustration to illustration and photography, we start to see the performers who are dressed in blackface sometimes are like inset within the context of the structure of the design. We also see accompanying sort of taglines, if you will, if are kind of thinking of design strategy in this context, or subheads, right? In this case, to sell the song. So sometimes we see a reference to race or the type of song that it is, situated at different points throughout the design of the cover as well. And the last sort of element that I'll show too, just in terms of thinking about structure, is that the bottom section generally has the name of the publisher, and sometimes many of them are included within some kind of banner. You'll see them kind of really ornately designed, illustrated inside of like a sort of banner that holds it prominently. And it's kind of like the label, if you will, of the cover itself to promote who published the song. And so in my research, I started looking really closely at a lot of the different the labels from these different music publishers. I started seeing similarities in terms of typography, in terms of the way that they're like ornately designed. There seems to be kind of a regal nature to it, right? That there's an authority that's been placed in terms of its structure. Generally, many of the ones that I've seen are uppercase. You also get some that bring in the textured pattern, but a lot of them are self-contained. They have a border that contains the logo itself. And the mark basically, again, is situated generally in the lower bottom region of the cover design. And so some of them are really beautiful. You know, as I start to pull them out, I'm able to kind of see, you know, the characteristics of the typography of this time, the handwriting quality, and the ways in which space is distributed, even for the label itself. And the really interesting piece for me has been trying to navigate who's illustrating these, or who's the designer, or that's our kind of contemporary take on it, but what they might have been called was the cover art designer. And so if we look closely at some of the music covers, some of them actually have the names of the different artists that are embedded in the bottom right or the bottom left corner or somewhere inside of the illustration. And I'm trying to do research right now, trying to learn more about who some of these individuals are. More often than not, the ones that I've come across, Star, Gio O. Hart, Edgar Martin Keller, Guy E. Turpin, these are all white men who are illustrating these covers. And it makes you think about the fact that we've got white publishers working with white songwriters and white performers, and thinking about where do these music sheet covers go, right? Or I would say the sheet music itself, where does it go, right? And there's a linear path to this, right? When we think about the audience that's consuming it. And as more Black performers were getting some of their songs published, again, there were many that were happening at this time. Sometimes they didn't get it published, but there are a few really prolific Black performers and songwriters who would be published through a white publisher to a very mixed audience. And so these dynamics create really interesting engagement for me in thinking about how one is receiving these designs, when one is encountering these designs, who had control over the design work process. Again, just to kind of mention who was the audience and where is audience, because if we think about this, the music sheets, I keep saying the music sheets, but the sheet music itself is something that would have potentially been played on a piano. And when we think about that, that's something that happens in the home. So if we're thinking, again, just kind of going back further, we think about the fact that there's like private performances, or thinking about private entertainment versus public entertainment, and things that might be out in a theater or more sort of open forum. And so for me as a designer, I've been thinking a lot about like, what are the implications of consuming these designs by Black audiences and non-Black audiences? What does it mean? And what does it mean for Black visual culture to be generated by white artists and designers, like some of the ones I just shown? What does it mean for them to be creating this version of what Black visual culture could be, based on other ideologies that are running through their mind and the sort of culture at large that's present at that moment? Because if we think back to all of that historical context that I was showing previously, we know that there's a running ideology around emancipation. We know that there's a running ideology around white supremacy, and the idea of reconstructing and building and sort of allowing a population of people to rebuild, right? So if we think about all of that, it really creates sort of, for me, I'm countering and thinking about the ways in which design strategy in these covers is being developed. One of the quotes that I also wanted to highlight from Stephanie Dunson, and it really speaks to kind of the significance of these questions that I'm posing. And she states, as a popular cultural medium, 19th century sheet music expressed the exchange of ideas, standards, and assumptions that informed and demonstrated predominant attitudes of the American populace. So it's important to kind of, I highlighted this and stress it because, as she mentions, right, if we think about like the music that were at one point, like a music CD or a vinyl record, right, that we would share it with a friend, or that we could purchase it and bring it to our home, right, that these are examples of the way in which entertainment was circulating ideology right on its front cover. I don't think it was necessarily, I don't think for me in this moment, as I look back, I think that they were trying to do what they thought would sell, right? So there's clearly an idea around how Blackness was then commodified to be able to sell this music and these songs to a wider audience. And so the next few examples of the music sheet covers that I found in my research, they're kind of divided in a couple of different categories. One that I just wanted to highlight has to do.
Kelly, you broke up.
Celebrated the plantation, which is another sort of theme that you'll see through, but also was trying to sound as though it was the Black person talking. So clearly it's spelled incorrectly in many respects, but that was the signal, right? So if we think about how design is now contributing for us to understand and associate a Black person to incorrect spelling, we're already building in this kind of implicit bias. And if we look at a lot of the scores, right, the interior of a music score might have the notes and the lyrics that go with the song. And then sometimes you might see on the back cover promotion for other songs of that catalog. Sometimes I've seen some that have examples of advertisements that are sort of promoting performances that are happening in different theaters. This is the music cover that I was inspired to name this talk after. And again, you see the same kind of use of ain't, dat instead of th, really sort of reflecting kind of what is thought to be the Black voice. And what I offer as a counter to this, I think, is that with Amiri Baraka, who wrote Blues People, he wrote that what is now, or what is called a now Southern accent or Negro speech, was once simply the accent of a foreigner trying to speak a new familiar language. And so that really counters this idea that you have Black folks that didn't know what was going on or were lazy or not smart, but perhaps the history of being brought to a new country where you're speaking a new language, there might be a bit of broken English because you're trying to adapt to a new environment. And so I look at these like very differently now, primarily because I'm thinking about the fact that, you know, if we bring in that history, we can see how despite someone being potentially really smart, that speech, understanding speech and seeing it typographically set really embeds a certain type of perspective. And then just to kind of jump into another subcategory, you will also see some of the music sheet covers where there's a reverement of like plantation life. So everything is joyful, people are dancing. It's like, oh my gosh, like let's sing our song on the slave plantation. And again, this is my interpretation of it now in 2020. But when I look at many of these, and it says I'm going back to Dixieland and kind of referencing this sort of like rural plantation life, it really cements this view that either Black people want to be back there or that white people want Black people to be back in that kind of context. And in some cases, you did have Black people who were really sort of kind of, you know, wanting to be back in a cultural norm that they knew, even if it had sort of tragic, sort of oppressive qualities to it. And so in this particular one, we see, again, a man looking up, and we could see that the sign in the top right says "To Dixie," right? That there's sort of tattered clothes, that he's wearing, you know, clothes and shoes that seem to be worn. And again, we're seeing these images of kind of like kind of a lack of care, or, you know, wanting to go back to an earlier time. And again, in another quote that I also wanted to flag here from Eileen Southern, this is from the Music of Black Americans, A History. She, just to kind of jump into the last sort of segments of it, but the public often attended the concerts of Black performers out of mere curiosity, but remained to acclaim the sound of a beautiful voice or the exhibition of an extraordinary technique. But we clearly see that slave musicians had established the tradition of providing dance music for white America. And so when we think about that sort of, that kind of ideology, and we then think about examples of what these covers do, they begin to sort of evoke, what, and speak to what a white audience might want to see on the cover, and the design starts to kind of really represent that. And in terms of social class, right, we might see examples of go way back and sit down. This is an example of kind of thinking about the segregated quality that was also happening at this time. Or I ain't seen no messenger boy, right, where clearly in this one, we see, and it's kind of wild, this little boy, what would have been a messenger boy, sort of in kind of direct alignment with a white woman. But clearly we see subservient role, and clearly we see status and class it's showing up in these designs. And then in terms of gender roles, right, another one that I came across was called Your Money's No Good. And I was really fascinated by this particular one because on the outside perimeter, we see clearly money symbols. And I was just thinking a lot between, I've told this to other people who've seen me kind of talk about this before, but I was just thinking about like Flavor Flav on the far right, or in this case where there was no, 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 no. I was thinking about like Beyonce, which made me think about Bugaboo in like Destiny's Child. And so for me, it's like this, like, what do I think, how does this reference the present? And, in the top left corner, we see Beyonce kind of putting her hand up, but it's this idea of gesture, right? And so if we just go back for a second, this woman's hand is like, nah, I'm not really interested. And we see that kind of show up in different forms, whether it's for a music video, other print or illustrated designs, but they are there. And in terms of, in this particular one, All Coons Look Alike to Me, A Darky Misunderstanding, this song was written by a Black person. And what was interesting in terms of the research around this is that as I was looking at the history around this particular song, it clearly, as we see in the design, really kind of derogatory illustration, oversized lips, oversized eyes, just using black as the sort of texture for the skin. When Ernest sang this song and made this song, we found that he was really disturbed about how this was perpetuating stereotypes. And so wild for me to read about that, it made me think about Dave Chappelle and the fact that he similarly was kind of wanting to entertain and perform, but at a certain point he realized what his artwork, if you will, or his sort of performances were doing that could be replaying and recycling these racial stereotypes. And I think there was like an interview that I saw of him that was like, who's laughing the hardest in this? And what does it mean for me to be putting out this content again? And then in terms of thinking about children, these are kind of the last few that I'll show, but these are even more disturbing, right? When we're thinking about the Black child and how they might be presented and perceived. And again, in a lot of these different music covers, we see that there's always these kind of ornate, decorative, floral kind of components. They sort of embed a darker, sinister quality to what's actually being stated typographically. So we see, if we look a little closer, attached to the stroller is "Nobody Steal Me," right? Like even crazier. And I'm assuming he's, or this particular infant is like drinking milk, but we don't know. I mean, I think what's wild in this is thinking about Black life and how typographically we're setting this up for it to feel as though it's not as significant. And one of the last ones too that I'll show here as well is this one, which is from the Prancing Pickaninnies. And again, because I go back and forth in time and thinking about the relationship between these images and images that are coming out today, we have Black children being represented also kind of, they look like they haven't been cared for. Similarly have tattered clothes. They look scary. And just 2 Sundays ago, you see references to that in Lovecraft Country, which I highly recommend if any of you are kind of looking at a lot of the symbolism in this. But Jigabobo, one of their episodes, they created kind of this embodiment of these print artifacts that I was looking at. and you see the kind of sinister quality to it. But imagine seeing an image of a Black child represented, where you're fearful, like you're creating the design that makes people fearful of interacting with a Black child or a Black person. And in terms of colorism, we see this showing up in terms of how race is then called out, right? The coffee-colored coon is one example, or I won't play second fiddle to no yellow girl, really speaking to the fact of kind of this Black woman is sort of like, no, I'm not wanting to sort of compete with someone who's lighter skinned. And we're developing in this moment in 1899, sort of this divide between, you know, within Black culture of anything that's closest to white is prioritized and is thought to be better, right? And the last one, even more crazy, she's getting more like the white folks every day, right? And like, I think that there's a weird contemporary twist to that, but this, in this case, is being stated by Black performers, Williams and Walker. And so I think that there's this interesting element of where you have Black folks that are also contributing to, you know, white supremacy and wanting to aspire to be closer to white. But often, like I said, you see, in this case, chocolate colored become the name of the song, but it's kind of referring to food, or as we saw previously, mocha java in terms of coffee. And they kind of, in this one, it's just creepy. I included it because his head looks weird. But ultimately, you know, just to kind of cite Baraka as well, Negroes who were highest in the social and economic hierarchy also became the most fanatic imitators of white society. So we see this element that even today, there's examples of this kind of alignment to white, closest to white, and to see design begin to sort of operate and put in full view the colorism, the gender roles, the social class, the way that Black children are seen and presented, or not seen as valued or of worth, that there are the ways in which the design plus the song plus the illustration really reinforce those concepts. And just to kind of conclude or kind of wrap up, you know, this research, are the things that I'm beginning to do as a design practitioner, as an artist. I'm just interested in working with this as raw material. I think the struggle for me at this point is that I'm not comfortable like working with some of these images, the illustrations, or the ways in which there's sort of a dehumanized quality to me of things that I'm finding in these works. But what I am excited about is this kind of way that I can start to mess with the typographic qualities of all of these different music sheet covers that I'm finding. And so these are things that are works in progress. Like I'm interested in combining and creating music added to this. Right now, there's no sound, but I'm really working through sort of playing with texture and layering and what happens when you use the elements from a lot of these music covers themselves. And so I have aspirations to do risograph printing. I started that before the pandemic, and hopefully when we're back able to kind of be in space again, I'll have the capacity to do that. But these are some of the variations that I've been working on that are similar to another series that I have. But again, it's like taking the snippets out and trying to sort of experiment with what's left, and what does color do? What happens when there's no illustration or photography left? Are we able to absorb and engage with these as typographic specimens? Are they more interesting to look at, more to kind of understand the vernacular, while not getting tripped up by sort of like the disturbing, distorted images that are also associated? So these are kind of, again, like works in progress where I'm wanting to kind of think about what is layered together, what remnants are left. Here's a kind of video of, you know, me working through this kind of process of like adjusting the sort of color combination and figuring out what's left. And I think my hand as a Black individual on top of what would have been potentially created by a white artist, for me, feels like a weird intervention. And I don't know exactly, what that means. But I think for me, it feels like a reclaiming of sorts. It feels like there's a way for me to learn and understand and read through this time through the act of making as well. And so these are just as much a part of my process of doing this like deep research as it is to the creation of these works itself. Kind of just in and really distort and play as far as I can to see what's possible. And the last two couple of images that I have are, this is like my kitchen where I've like started printing some of these out, and I ideally would like to print them larger, but as of right now, they're kind of 11 by 17 or 8.5 by 11. And there are just ways for me to kind of dive deeper through the making process while also doing sort of this critical research around it at the same time. And so I know that I'm sort of, coming to the end here, but the last piece that I'll sort of share is that a lot of these books in terms of further reading have been really essential for me, and really thinking about, music, thinking about entertainment, thinking about its intersection with design and understanding how language actually is informed, but also thinking about the design strategy that has developed that created a lot of what I think are really lasting imprints on the design field and the way that we see Blackness represented in print itself. So with that, I'll pause there because I know that we have about, I think, 10 minutes left. But I, again, really appreciate and thank Paul and Carol and everyone at TDC for inviting me to share this work.
Thank you. Thank you, Kelly. We have a question from the audience. Are you thinking about exhibiting your work once you've completed it, I guess?
I mean, that's a hope. I have, yes, aspirations to do that. I think that, I'm kind of working small in some ways right now, just in, what printers I have at my disposal. But I do and would hope to kind of exhibit a lot of this work. So I have aspirations for it, definitely.
And since there aren't that many, can you guys use your Q&A if you have any questions for Kelly? In the meantime, I have a few questions for her. So how did you settle on, I know you've discussed this a little bit in your talk, but how did you settle on sheet music, or and I know it's partly because of the sort of domestic nature of it, and its sort of prevalence during the late 19th century, early 20th century.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I'll say that like it's an evolution. I think I've always really loved music, film, television. Right. And so I think from the standpoint of just my general interest in that space, there was already like kind of me looking at contemporary examples of music. But in a lot of the research that I was doing, every time that I came across like an article, there were some articles that really specifically explained that things were rooted from the past, right? And came from an earlier time, whether it was stereotypes or examples of like, how something might be represented. And so I think that I was kind of trying to follow the path of the music cover and like that's why it kind of showed the Spotify and worked my way back to think about like, what was the visual that was tied to music? And around the period that I started is kind of when I was coming across a lot of these examples. And I was most interested in the ones where Blackness was represented, and really trying to understand how it kind of played out in those designs.
We have a question from, I guess this is Bobby Martin. How does your reinterpretation of the typography impact on the modern design community? How does it impact culture? And there's another one, if you can answer it. How does bringing back racist language and imagery contribute positively to what we're dealing with in the world right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I've struggled with wanting to publicly share like my research on this, partially because of those questions, right? Like, what does it mean to reshare these images? What does it mean to kind of create and almost inflict another sense of like a tragic sort of part of our history? And, you know, I think at the same time, what I've realized is that, you know, as I started my presentation, we have a lot of people who just don't know any of this context. And by context, I mean like the context around how certain stereotypes are influencing our design strategies, how certain stereotypes are still happening and people are making mistakes, because there's been sort of like I think, a resistance to sharing this material because it's hard and it's difficult to talk about. And then I also think that it's, you know, it's to be avoided. It's the same reason we have like situations now where we're trying to deal with diversity, equity, inclusion issues, and there's a resistance from people who don't want to or don't feel like there's anything that needs to be changed. And so I think there needs to be a frank conversation about what has existed, what it means for us culturally, not for us to, and this is kind of, if I was talking to Trump, it's for us to understand racially where we have been so that we can avoid creating situations going forward where we're not being open to understanding of people's histories and cultures. And so I think that I'm mindful of it as a designer in creating experiments that kind of reassert the same kind of stereotypes, but I also see them as type specimens that act as sort of, you know, extracts from work that has existed in the past. I think that's also one reason why I haven't been able to, as I mentioned, I don't want to play with the illustrations that have been really derogatory. I don't think that, to me, is, for me personally, I'm not interested in doing that, but typographically, I'm interested in exploring the language piece. I don't know if that sort of answers the question.
Okay, another question. In your process, do you think subverting the imagery, do you think about subverting the imagery as well at some point? And I know you sort of answered that in your question just now. I
think I'm not there yet. I think in terms of the imagery, I think I'm not quite there, if I'm honest. I think it's, you know, there's still baggage that I'm carrying. It's not like I'm kind of designing in a vacuum, but I think that I'm not quite at a point where I can sort of pick up this illustration and just have fun with it. So there's a weird rupture, I think, in that moment.
Another question from Annabelle Gould. The text you're using is exactly from the old covers right now, correct?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And have you considered incorporating text from current conversations in the media and politics while still referencing the vernacular typography from the old covers?
I haven't yet, but that's a good idea. So I think I definitely might explore that for sure. I think it's a good point.
From an anonymous attendee, what kind of reaction are you trying to, or is it like a moment of reflection that are you trying to evoke with your work?
I think that, you know, at this point, you know, the experiments that I'm doing they're part of my process. I don't know about like necessarily trying to get a reaction from someone as so much as it's my ability to look closer at the works by my deconstruction of the works. So I think that a lot of it's been tied to process and just the things that I'm really hyper focused on and looking at. So I think in this moment, even putting this out publicly, I think it's a vulnerable space for me to be in. And, you know, looking at this material and not exactly knowing what the read is, especially in this kind of political, social climate, there's all kinds of reads and, you know, entry points that people are coming to this work with that might be positive and negative reactions to what I'm doing.
Okay. A question from Stephen Clunas. So it says thank you for your presentation. And then as a Black designer in a predominantly non-Black space or spaces, I struggle to project my authentic creative voice. How do you strike that balance in your work?
Oh, how do I strike the balance? That's an ongoing thing. I think that for me, and a lot of the work that I've produced and made, I've taken ownership of my identity in that. Like I really wanted to be aware of my positionality as a Black woman, as a designer. And I think that a lot of the work that I do, I just am open to talking about race, and I'm open to talking about it, and exploring it and making work that addresses it. And so I think that for me, that's been helpful in terms of my sustainability in the design community. It's been helpful in terms of reaching out to other designers of color that are, either dealing with similar things that I'm dealing with. And there's an authenticity in our discussion. And I think from the other side of it, in the sort of spaces where you may be the only Black person, I think I'm encouraged knowing that I'm not a crazy person when I'm saying something in a meeting, because it happens. And, just about like sort of doing historical research around any of this stuff. Like, I think there's been instances where I felt like I wasn't seen. And I think that it's about creating a sense of for me, it's like thinking about the ways that I'm fueled and talking with those that are interested and understand what I'm trying to do. And it is a balance that there's moments that I'll be just frank that it sucks. It just sucks. And so I think that there's moments where it's like that. And I think there's other moments where I'm recharged and fueled by my peers, that recenter me.
So it's a follow-up from Bobby, like, what do you think there needs to be change in the design community, or what needs to change in the design community? Or is this more of a larger societal issue?
Like what part? What needs to what do you mean by what needs to change?
In terms of accepting or having people of color or Black designers being accepted more in the community, or just the idea that their voices are or their authentic voices is accepted
Yeah,
in their
I mean,
community.
I think what, again, I'll just kind of speak to my understanding of history, and specifically the history in terms of the US, right? I think that my lens is definitely skewed in some ways based on things that have happened in this society. And I think that I feel at times like we haven't moved far enough because of all the things that I just mentioned, right? That there's still resistance to our ability to exist as people. So let alone be a designer, we as Black people, like these essential needs that we need to have to exist freely in space, those things aren't even being met. So the idea of like a designer on top of that, that's like a added bonus if we're able to kind of get to that point. And so I think that for me, there's this like piece that needs to happen almost before the conversation of being a designer about where society actually needs to go in terms of all the things that I was talking about before, of being aware of the bias and the racial discrimination that's happening. And so I think that's where I want, as a society, all sectors to really be doing deep dives on this. I'm doing it from a art and design focus, but there's so many scholars and activists and performers, every industry, there's people doing this work. And I think that collectively, all of that work it needs to contribute to like a huge movement forward. So I think it's bigger than just the designer question, and more about just a kind of collective culture question. How do we get to that point, I think, is where I'm at.
Do you think this imagery is still prevalent currently? Like what you're researching? I know we've sort of never really finished Reconstruction, and we're still fighting that episode in history. But do you think there's this kind of culture still exists? This, obviously, yeah, it still exists, but in terms of like the explicitness of it? Do you still find contemporary stuff and, you know?
Yeah, I mean, like examples of like it kind of borrowing from stereotypes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think I see it all the time in different advertisements that are targeted to potentially Black audiences, right? I think that there's, you know, the language piece. I could in a Sprite commercial. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Like a Sprite ad for a product, or I've seen it in McDonald's ads that are featured on like BET that are targeted to Black audiences. There's a way of using language, of using the Black body to represent, you know, stereotypes. Well, they're not necessarily saying, you know, derogatory slurs necessarily. There's other means in which it reinforces the stereotype that, you know, graffiti is like associated with a particular culture, or language is associated with a particular culture. And there may be examples of it being connected to it, but I think that I'm just interested in like what we can sort of decipher from how those, in this case, in my case, like stereotypes have started. So if I look at the one that was like, all I want is my chickens, me in this present context was like, how did that stereotype come about? And there's a lot of other scholars who talk deeply about like, you know, that chicken was a cheaper food and all of these various pieces. There's scholarship that's already built on that. But for me, as a seeing it in print design is different, because then I'm like, oh, I see how it came about inside of like a printed form, that stereotype, versus like being folklore or a myth that was told to me, just, you know, growing up in school or in society.
Another question. What do you see yourself in 5-10 years?
Where do I see
or this work in a few months?
I hope I still have a job. I hope we're out of the pandemic. You know, ideally I mean, that's such a loaded question. I think that I'm interested in continuing to dive deeper. I think a lot of this research is like an expansion of things that I've always looked at, whether it was undergrad or graduate school. And I think I've just been trying to dig further into it. I've been trying to trust the weird experiments that I'm doing. And so I hope that I'm able to keep doing that and keep finding new things to look at closely. So I'm hoping that I'm still designing, and I hope I'm still employed, and I hope I'm meeting more Black designers, more artists and designers of color. I hope our spaces change as like more material is becoming accessible for people to see. I think one of my books will come out next year, Black, Brown, and Latinx Design Educators. So I'll plug that here, that I hope that contributes to the canon that needs to diversify. And I think that I'm hopeful that like it just shows experiences from others that have been trying to navigate this space as well.
Great. Unless there's any other questions, I think we'll end there. Thank you again. I will send you all the Q&A if you want to directly respond to, or
yeah, please do. I think that would be
this way we cover everybody, and
yeah, there's some really good
no feelings are hurt.
Yeah, I'm like trying to screenshot some of
I know it's hard. Sorry, it's hard to like follow all these threads. So thank you again, and thank you for all the people who've attended this afternoon, and we'll see you again next week. Thank you. Thanks, Kelly.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.